So we all know Donald Trump has spent years telling Canada to spend more on defense. Well, Canada is doing just that, spending more. The part the US may not have expected is that Canada is also deciding who gets the money, where the equipment is built, and how much control Canada keeps after that contract is signed.
While Donald Trump was busy trying to tariff smoke from wilderness fires coming from Canada, Mark Carney announced almost $2 billion for 190 new armored combat support vehicles. They will be built in London, Ontario, and the purchase will bring Canada's fleet from 360 vehicles to 550. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a military procurement announcement. Another contract, another fleet number, another podium with a flag behind it.
But underneath that announcement is a much bigger shift happening. Canada is trying to turn defense spending into industrial power. Factories, skilled workers, Canadian suppliers, Canadian research, Canadian maintenance capability. Washington wanted Canada to open its wallet. Well, Canada is doing that, but it's also trying to keep the money, the factory, and the long-term leverage. And the armored vehicles are only the first test of whether this new Canadian approach can actually work.
So let's begin with the basic purchase. Canada will spend almost $2 billion over 4 years on 190 armored combat support vehicles for the Canadian military. The vehicles will be designed, built, and assembled in Canada by General Dynamics Land Systems. Once delivered, Canada will have a fleet of 550 armored combat support vehicles.
And these vehicles are built to support military operations. They carry people, equipment, and supplies. They protect crews while moving through dangerous environments. They give the armed forces the ability to operate without sending every logistical vehicle into exposed territory. In plain language, they help the military move and function when the environment becomes hostile.
So 190 vehicles may sound less exciting than fighter jets or submarines, but military capability depends heavily on the equipment that keeps personnel and supplies moving behind the front line. That is the first reason this purchase is more important than the headline suggests. Canada is buying a capability. Ottawa is also trying to build an industry around that capability.
The new agreement is expected to create or sustain more than 6,000 jobs across Canada every year for 8 years. The supply chain reaches well beyond London, including Canadian steel, electronics, imaging equipment, cables, engineering, and specialized components. Suddenly, a defense contract starts affecting workers who may never ever go anywhere near a military base.
This is where Prime Minister Carney's defense policy becomes an economic policy. Canada is going to spend an enormous amount of public money rebuilding the military. His argument is that the money should leave behind factories, skills, intellectual property, and companies that can continue selling to allies after the Canadian order is complete.
Yeah, for decades, Canadian governments usually treated defense procurement as a shopping decision, right? The military identified a piece of equipment, Ottawa searched the international market, and a large portion of the money eventually flowed to foreign suppliers. And according to the government's own figures, roughly 70% of Canadian military capital spending has been going to the United States.
The problem is, when a country becomes unstable, they still control the country's spare parts, the software updates, maintenance schedule, or production line. Canada may own the equipment, but it can still be waiting for somebody else to decide when it can be repaired, upgraded, or replaced. And under the Trump government, he has no reason to do that because we all know that he wants Canada.
Right. Mark Carney's answer is a 3-part policy called Build, Partner, Buy. Now, it sounds like something printed on a conference banner beside a bowl of expensive Canadian cheese, but the order of those is important here.
Right. So let's talk about it. First comes build. When Canada has the ability to produce something domestically, the government wants Canadian production to be the default. That doesn't mean that Canada can manufacture every aircraft, engine, radar system, or submarine component from scratch, but it does mean that Ottawa is finally treating defense contracts as long-term industrial decisions instead of just quick shopping trips based only on the lowest initial price.
Second comes partner. Canada can work with allies like Sweden, Germany, and other NATO countries to gain access to advanced technology while securing Canadian production, research, and jobs. That's where the Saab Global Eye proposal fits into all of this. The aircraft uses Bombardier jets built in Canada. The arrangement would support Canadian jobs and include Canadian production as part of a wider international fleet.
The third word is buy. Sometimes Canada will need to purchase equipment from foreign suppliers. That's just the reality. But the new approach says foreign purchases should come with conditions. They should be built in Canada where possible. They need to hire Canadian workers, use Canadian suppliers, support research and development in Canada, and help Canada develop the ability to maintain and upgrade the equipment on their own over time.
What Canada's doing here is they're trying to avoid the old arrangement where a foreign company receives the contract, the equipment arrives from somewhere else, and Canadian taxpayers remain dependent on the original supplier for decades and decades. That simply just doesn't work for Canadians anymore. The build, partner, buy strategy is the perfect example of what industrial and defense sovereignty looks like.
The jobs component is the most important part. Canadians want to make some money. Now, defense companies, they don't expand because a politician gives a speech. They expand when they believe the orders will continue, the supply chain will be reliable, and the government will still be their customer several years after the initial contract.
And that predictable demand allows companies to buy equipment, train workers, expand facilities, and invest in research. It can also give smaller suppliers a reason to take on the cost of entering the defense sector. The supply chain, it already stretches across several provinces. Ryan Manufacturing in British Columbia is expected to provide military-grade cable and wire harnesses assemblies.
Interpro in Regina, Saskatchewan is expected to produce advanced armor. Thales Canada in Quebec will supply thermal imaging systems. IMP Aerospace and Defense in Nova Scotia will provide other specialized components. We've got coast to coast. Now we just need the other coast.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to remember here, those details, they're important because the contract is not simply about one factory in London, right? It's about whether defense spending can create a network of Canadian capabilities. A factory assembles the final vehicle, yes, but hundreds of other decisions determine whether the country can keep producing, repairing, and improving that vehicle years later. And this is where the armored vehicles connect to the larger defense strategy. Canada is not looking at one contract in isolation. The government is also pursuing that Saab's Global Eye surveillance aircraft and the major submarine announcement with Germany's ThyssenKrupp marine systems. The main message here is that a country can spend enormous amounts on defense and still remain dependent if it cannot repair its equipment, replace critical components, or train the people needed to operate the systems. That's the trap that Canada is trying to avoid. You can own an impressive aircraft and still be vulnerable if somebody else controls the software, the spare parts, and the maintenance schedule.
Now, the goal is not to isolate Canada from its allies, but the goal is to make Canada a more useful and more capable ally. We've said it before. There's a difference between partnership and dependence. A partner, they bring capability to the table. A dependent customer waits for permission and hopes the supply chain remains friendly.
For years, Washington pushed Canada to spend more on defense. So the snarky version of this is simple. Canada's spending more, but it's trying to stop being the customer who pays for the restaurant supplies, the ingredients, and still gets told what goes on the menu.
Yeah.
The serious version of this is that the procurement is becoming part of a national security.
The purchase of 190 armored vehicles is the visible part. The larger change is Canada deciding that defense spending should build more than just military hardware. It should build industrial capacity, factories, skilled employment, research, supply chains, and the confidence to make decisions without waiting for another country to approve them.
Now, one detail that's worth mentioning briefly here, because I know people will go after this in the comments, is that the Canadian facility delivering these vehicles operates under General Dynamics Land Systems Canada, which is part of a larger American defense company. The important measure for Canada will be the production, jobs, suppliers, and long-term capability secured here at home.
And that's the standard that Ottawa has to enforce. We live in a global world. It may be an American company, but there is a Canadian branch. And this is a good deal because they're building in Canada, using Canadian employees and building factories, and they're going to leave an industrial footprint. It's kind of like Tim Hortons. We still support Tim Hortons because they are all locally owned, even though the big umbrella company is based in Brazil.
Yeah, that's a good example. So here's the question we want to pose to you today. Do you think that this shift away from U.S. dependence is good for Canada in the future?
Or do you think it will be backfiring and will be left isolated? Now check out the pinned comment below for our Substack. Hey, we're growing and Dave is getting spicy. Check out our merch and our private Facebook group.
And as always, give us a like, a hype, and a share so other people can learn and weigh in on this as well.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.